Hey listeners, it's Tim. Can I just grab a quick minute before the show starts? As you've probably heard, Top Music Live, our dynamic 2-day in-person conference for music teachers, is being held in Sydney during the Term 2 Australian school holidays over the 15th and 16th of April 2026. Our presenters have now been announced: Dr. Anita Collins, yours truly, Elisa Milne, Samantha Coates, Rebecca Stewart, Mark Matthews, Paul Myatt, Amber Hammond. The list goes on. It is an incredible lineup, and I just cannot wait to share this experience with you. This innovative event is unlike any other conference you've attended, unless you came to Piano Pivot Live in 2020, of course. We'll have amazing keynotes, interactive workshops, live on-stage teaching demonstrations, and opportunities to connect with fellow educators, all in a welcoming, relaxed atmosphere with full catering. See the complete 2-day schedule and book your ticket now at topmusiclive.com.
So it just felt like kind of a lottery. It's like hit or miss. It's like, I hope today's a good day. I hope I put in enough repetitions. And that's not the most mentally engaging and creatively satisfying way to approach practicing. I didn't realize that there were other ways of practicing until, again, I was like nearing the end of my master's program. And not only was it more engaging to practice and spend my time doing that kind of activity, but it also led to a much clearer connection between how I sounded in the practice room and how I felt and sounded on stage as well.
You're listening to the Topcast, the original podcast for growth-minded instrumental music and voice teachers since 2015, with your host, Tim Topham. Our mission at Top Music is to empower instrumental music and voice teachers to find and nurture their innate creativity so that they can teach lessons that are innovative, integrated, and inspiring, and that will have a positive lifelong impact on their students. Join us each week as we interview teachers and creators from around the world and unpack fun and exciting ideas to maximize your teaching and studio business success. Hi there, teachers. Welcome back to the Topcast. Thank you so much for joining me again today. I hope you've been enjoying this month's focus on performance, performing, everything to do with performance anxiety, and just helping our students be stage ready. And I think that actually applies to us as well, doesn't it? Because it's really easy to be pretty nervous as teachers because we don't actually get to play and perform that much. So I know a lot of the strategies that we'll be talking about in today's episode will be just as relevant to us as teachers as it is for us helping our students. So in today's episode, I'm going to be playing a replay of a webinar that we did with Noa Kageyama, the Bulletproof musician, back in 2022. It was called Bulletproof Performance and Practice Strategies, and it's all about Noa's key tips, oftentimes quite unusual, I think I'd say, for getting the most out of practice and helping that actually achieve great stage presence and success on stage, which is ultimately what we want when we have our students perform. So I'm going to hit play in just a minute on the webinar, and I'm going to start by introducing what you're going to be learning from listening to the episode today. And I do hope you enjoy it, and I'll get back to you at the end. But before that, let me introduce Noa. Noa Kageyama, if you haven't met him, is a performance psychologist and faculty member at the Juilliard School and the Cleveland Institute of Music. He's a conservatory-trained violinist with degrees from Oberlin and Juilliard, and he later completed a PhD in counseling psychology at Indiana University. He now specializes in helping performers thrive under pressure using sport psychology principles. He's presented workshops at leading institutions, including Curtis, Eastman, Peabody, McGill, and Northwestern, and his work has been featured in outlets such as The Wall Street Journal, CNN, and TED-Ed. Through his courses and his blog and his podcast, The Bulletproof Musician, he has supported more than 8,000 musicians worldwide and reaches over 45,000 subscribers each week. All right, let's tune in to Noa Kageyama. So today we're going to be talking about practicing more effectively, fostering confident performances in your students, and hopefully getting you to understand the "it sounded better at home" conundrum. We all have it. We probably personally experience it as well. And so we're going to be unpacking some of the reasons behind that. And I also want you to consider how what we talk about today can affect and improve your own practice and performance confidence as a teacher, because really, if we are teaching an instrumental instrument, we should be playing and practicing ourselves. It's really hard sometimes, and it's easy to get further and further away from actually playing your instrument. But I want today's session to encourage you to get back to it. If you've had a bit of a break or you've been struggling to do it, get back to some regular practice, exploring your instrument, learning new repertoire, and you can use some of the ideas from today when you do that. For those of you who've been on a webinar with us before, I love giving away some freebies. So we've got a couple of freebies for you for today. So these will be emailed to anyone who stays through to the end of the webinar. It's our left-hand guide to piano patterns and styles, and also a one-pager on interleaved practice, which is one of the things we'll be talking about today. Now, I did hear from my team that we had a little GDPR issue. Such fun. These are some of the issues with clicking checkboxes to allow us to actually send you things. So could I just get you at some stage, you don't have to do it right now, but some stage in the next couple of hours, to just head over to topmusic.co/free-bonus, and you'll see this page, and just enter your information in here. That will allow us to send those bonuses to you. Because some people, unfortunately, they may have missed a checkbox or something like that. And so we won't be able to send you the bonuses. So it doesn't matter if you've already done it. Just go and do that in the next hour or two. There's no hurry. You don't have to do it right now. And if you do have any issues, just send an email to support@topmusic.co. We'll get it all sorted out for you. So just scribble that down if you can, topmusic.co/free-bonus. And you can see it's in the link there. Tim's, who's doing admin for us, has put a link there. You can click, just open it in a new tab for later if you'd like. All right. You'll be also able to get a certificate of professional learning, which we always give our attendees. And we'll have a nice Q&A at the end. If you do lose audio or video, there should be reconnect buttons somewhere. Otherwise, refresh your whole page. Or if you get completely lost, then just head back to your email and you should be able to rejoin the room through that. And with that said, Noah, I think we can get started. So I'm going to just turn off our screen share, and we're going to run this webinar very much as a conversation. And so we encourage you to put questions and comments into the chat, and I'm going to keep an eye on those as much as I can. And we'll try and make sure Noah gets asked the questions that you have as well. But we're really going to be exploring two key issues around practicing today. The mindless repetition that students fall into the trap of doing, and indeed, I do it as well sometimes. I'm sure many of you have had that same experience. It's kind of the easy way out in some ways. And looking at that, it sounded better at home issue. So they're the two ones we're going to be tackling today. And as I said before, I hope they're as valuable for you as they are for your students. I've been doing a lot of more practice than usual, actually, because of the live stream lessons I've been taking with Fred Karpov from Entrada Piano. Some of you may have been watching some of those. I hope you've enjoyed them if you have. It's really interesting to be a fly on the wall, I think, when someone's having a lesson. And so I've already started using some of these ideas that Noah's been sharing with me. And it definitely, in some ways, practice is a bit harder, but far more effective. And we'll talk about all that. Noah, let's start with a bit of a story. Can you tell us about a student or a teacher you've worked with who's really been able to transform their practice through the kinds of things that you do? Or it might be someone that you've researched in depth. Or can you tell us a bit of a story about how this actually plays out in practice?
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, I think a lot of this comes back to my own experience being a kid. I mean, I started when I was 2.5. And, when you're 2.5, I think it's actually kind of fun because it's like this novel thing. But then relatively quickly, I think the novelty wears off and it's not necessarily so fun to practice anymore. Playing might still be fun, but practicing starts to feel a little bit more effortful. And so maybe I was a little bit more extreme than most, but I really resisted practicing and did not enjoy any bit of it at all, really for the next 20 some years. And so,
it's
you might
refreshing
ask,
to hear, can I just say?
And it really wasn't until the end of my master's program where I started to understand what practicing was like supposed to look like, or what it could look like anyway. And I started to, for most of my life, practicing just felt like a crapshoot. Try to get in as many repetitions of it sounding exactly the way that you want it to sound as possible. And then hopefully that would translate into sounding good on stage. And sometimes it did, and a lot of times it didn't. And so it just felt like kind of a lottery. It's like hit or miss. It's like, I hope today's a good day. I hope I put in enough repetitions. And that's not the most mentally engaging and creatively satisfying way to approach practicing. I didn't realize that there were other ways of practicing until, again, I was like nearing the end of my master's program. And not only was it more engaging to practice and spend my time doing that kind of activity, but it also led to a much clearer connection between how I sounded in the practice room and how I felt and sounded on stage as well. And so when I get to work with other students of various ages, that's the thing that I'm usually most happy to hear, that not only are they sounding better and able to play more like themselves on stage, but they actually don't mind practicing as much, which just for me personally, in my background, also feels meaningful. And so I was looking at some of the feedback that some of my students from this past semester actually submitted recently, and specifically with this practice exercise that we had worked on in class. One of the things that she talked about was something that I'm assuming most of you can relate to, which is one of the hardest parts of practicing is even just getting started, right? And I think this is something that everyone experiences, even at the professional level. I remember talking to cellist Natasha Brovsky and her late husband, violist Roger Tapping, and they were both talking about how if they saw either of the other, cleaning the bathroom or like organizing the closet, like they would kind of joke, it's like, oh, is it time to practice? And there's some bit of truth to that, I think. And so one of the things that my student described is using some of these other techniques. Some of it might just be the novelty of having different approaches to practice, but she said she found it easier to get started. And part of that was also related to it not being so frustrating to go through the process of practicing. And she also found it easier to sustain her focus. And so there are a lot of little tiny things that can start changing our experience in the practice room once we start implementing.
It has to be said, it's refreshing to hear that even professional musicians will procrastinate and struggle to get started with practice. I'm not sure what hope there is for all of us if that's the case, but no, it is hard. But I often say to students too, part of the challenge is just getting started. So for our two who are both now playing trumpet, leave your trumpet out and don't put it away and put it under your bed. Leave it out, leave the music out. It's much more likely that you'll come and pick it up. And sure enough, after dinner or something, we'll hear these weird dying cow sounds down the other end of the house when one of them's just picked up his trumpet because it's in front of him while he walks past. So I think that's, getting started is definitely something to talk about. Easier for pianists because we kind of have the piano open most of the time. Now, a lot of your initial research was in sports psychology, so I'm really interested to make this connection. How did you bridge the gap looking at sports and being able to bring that over to music?
Yeah, I think initially when I first encountered sports psychology, I took this class with Don Green at Juilliard, who many of you I'm sure are familiar with. And before I met him and before I learned what we would be learning about, I kind of assumed the same thing too. I was like, oh, athletes, yeah, it's all performance, but they're so different. And what am I going to learn about performing better on stage with my violin from someone who really only understands sport? And as soon as I started learning about these concepts, and even myself going back to school to learn about this, I realized that it's all kind of the same, honestly. Like there are obviously a lot of differences, but there are almost as many differences between instruments as there are between music in general and different types of sports. And so it actually wasn't super difficult to bridge the gap. And actually what translation is required is actually kind of fun because it's a little bit like cross-training. We can take different things from, in the same way that it can be kind of exciting to learn about breathing from a singer or phrasing from a singer and applying that to piano or violin. It can be fun to take things that are true in sports and find ways of applying them to music as well.
And we'll dig into how that actually looks in a moment. But let's talk about practice today. What does most student practice look like today, and what's the problem with it?
I think of this as like the autocorrect method of practicing, where you just start playing something and you hear something that doesn't sound great. And, if you're lucky, your student will stop and actually rewind a little bit. And then they'll do it a few times until it starts to sound better, right? Like we just instinctively know to make certain adjustments. In the same way that if we're trying to throw a piece of, trash from our desk into the trash can across the room, if we get multiple opportunities to do that, we'll start getting closer and closer generally, just because we are able to calibrate our movements to the demands and it sounds better. And then once it sounds better, we're feeling pretty good about ourselves and we move on to the next thing that comes up in the piece that doesn't sound so great. And we just kind of work our way through the piece, auto-correcting our way and instinctively making adjustments, intuiting our way to a better level of performance at the end of the day. Problem, of course, is it involves a lot of kind of mindless repetition. Like we're not really thinking about why something didn't work out or what we need to change exactly. And I'm not saying that this is entirely unproductive or unhelpful. I mean, I I mindless practiced my way to a decent level for 2 decades. And so it's not like it doesn't work. There are actually even some benefits, believe it or not, to this type of what's called implicit learning. It's how you learn how to ride a bike, right? And you never forget exactly how to ride a bike because you've just kind of internalized how to do it. Problem, of course, though, is for a lot of people, it's just not the most mentally engaging or creatively satisfying or fun way to practice, and tends to be kind of slow, and you lose a lot. Like it doesn't translate very well into playing something exactly the way you want the very first time. You can get it on the 3rd time, the 5th time, the 7th time, but it's not necessarily the case that you can get it the way you want on the first time.
Yeah, I've got this slide that I put together. Took me a long time, actually. It's quite in depth, as you can see. And it's a bit of a joke as well. But this is what students do. And you mentioned, they'll stop and fix errors. There's a lot of my students who will play through something and not even really be listening to what they're doing actively enough to know to stop and fix something. I wonder if any of the teachers watching have experienced that same thing. So they'll literally play through and then go back to the start and play through and then play through and not really take much notice of what is actually going on in their fingers. Maybe that's just my students, but have you experienced that situation as well, where it's even more basic than that? We've got a few teachers. Yes, drives me nuts, says Claire.
Yeah, I certainly remember doing that myself and kind of thinking that's, I mean, honestly, like that's even how my mom started this practice kind of to-do list for me with all these empty circles that I was allowed to fill in with a smiley face. I usually didn't put in a smiley face. I made kind of like an unhappy looking face to kind of mock the purpose of this. But yeah, the idea was, if I got through a piece, I'd do a happy face. And sometimes there were 3 circles lined up because I was supposed to go through the piece 3 times. And I felt like the sooner I can get through these pieces as quickly as possible, the sooner I could be done with practicing. And so, yeah, for a long time, that was just kind of how I measured whether I had practiced or not.
Right. Yeah. Actually, and there's a lot of people saying that their students actually have the other issue, which is that they stop to fix the problem. But what normally happens, of course, is they'll play through, let's say, 8 bars, and then they'll stop. They'll have a problem, but they won't stop and fix it there. What do? Go back to the start and play up, and they keep hitting this roadblock, don't they? And it never gets better. So we've got a lot of skills to teach our students, haven't we? We can't assume that they're just going to know how to do this. What do we call this? Other than mindless, this kind of practice, is there a name for this? And what should we be moving towards?
Well, the term that I'm assuming most people are familiar with at this point was coined by Anders Ericsson, who's a psychologist at the University of, I always get the Florida universities confused. I think it was Florida State University is where he was for many years. And he's written all these books and papers. And if you've ever heard the term deliberate practice, it's because of Ericsson. And what he found, he initially, I think in his career, started out looking for evidence of natural talent. And there are certain things that are useful, like being tall is helpful for basketball players, and, percentage of fast twitch muscle fibers, or, the length of your Achilles. Like there are physical factors that can make it easier for us to perform different feats at different levels. But largely speaking, he struggled to find clear evidence of talent in all these areas. And what he found instead was that the best performers in many domains tended to approach practicing differently. Like they engaged in a different sort of practice process than most of us do. Like they didn't do as much of this mindless, autocorrect, intuitive repetition, but instead were very thoughtful about each practice attempt and each practice repetition, and made adjustments and so forth. And so this type of deliberate practice sounds like a lot more work, and it kind of is, like you were saying. But I mean, at least for me, and I think for a lot of students, it does make practicing much more interesting and kind of intellectually stimulating, and at the end of the day, more satisfying too, because then it feels like something actually happened. It's not this that you went through something over and over and you can write down that you did that 3 times, but you actually learned something or discovered something, and something tangibly changed that's replicable, which is pretty exciting and makes you feel like you're actually capable of improving on your own efforts and problem solving.
So let's talk about this thoughtful or deliberate practice. So what we're trying to avoid is the mindless repetition. by getting students to think before they play, plan something to do, then execute it, and then reflect on it. And I might bring up your model so that you could talk about this, Noah, as the model for a more thoughtful or deliberate approach. You're able to talk us through how this would work with students in our studio, how we could get them to start thinking this way.
Yeah. So this process that I think you're bringing up is technically known as self-regulated learning, and it's just as applicable to the classroom and any other subject. And it doesn't have to be just music; it could be sports as well. And it has these three phases. The first phase is a forethought phase, like Tim was saying, to have some sort of a plan in mind of what you're going to do before you do it. And then there's a performance phase where you actually do the thing that you're trying to do. And then there's a self-reflection phase where you take a moment to reflect on what just happened, why that happened, in such a way that it helps you come up with a new plan to experiment with. And so it really is about experimenting. Like, in each repetition shouldn't be just a mindless repetition, but like a new experiment that you're running to see what happens when you tweak one variable or two variables and so forth. So, so for me, for instance, when I used to do the mindless repetition and I had a tricky shift and something was out of tune, I wouldn't even think about whether it was sharp or flat. I just think, oh, it's out of tune. Let me just do it a bunch of times until it's not out of tune anymore. And I wouldn't know if I adjusted so that things are a little bit sharper or if things are flatter. Like, I don't know if it's because I released tension in my thumb or because I pulled my elbow around a fraction of a second sooner, or if I lifted up more, or if I released tension with my chin. Like, I wouldn't have known what exactly I did differently. I just know that I got the result that I wanted on like the 7th repetition, and hoping that, hopefully next time on the 1st repetition, it'll sound like the 7th repetition. But of course, we all know that that is not how practice works, yet we continue to practice that way anyway, hoping that it'll start getting shorter and shorter. Like, instead of it being the 7th repetition, maybe it'll be the 5th repetition next time, and then the 3rd, and then the 1st. And it does get closer to the 1st, but we usually get kind of stalled out where it's like still 50-50 at best. So
I was thinking about this when I've been working on a couple of scherzi from Chopin, and the second scherzo in B flat minor, it's a very, very popular one, ends with a chord in the center of the piano, 2 hands in the center, and then you've got to suddenly jump out and hit almost the top and bottom notes of the piano at the same time within a second. And this is really fun. I find this kind of thing quite fun. But what I'll find myself doing is going boom, boom, oh, missed, boom, boom, missed. Oh, okay, I just need to go a bit in, boom, boom, missed, boom, boom, and then I'll eventually start getting it, or I might go slowly and hover and then land. But to then actually use this process and stop and go, okay, what am I trying to do in this next repetition? All right, I'm going to aim for the right hand to hit in exactly the right spot. How am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to kind of judge it with the movement of my elbow, how far I'm going. And so just thinking and then trying, but most importantly, stopping before I repeat it to go, okay, what happened? I think that's almost the most critical thing that is so easy to miss, that reflection stage.
Right. Yeah, there's a great basketball study where they looked at self-regulated learning and essentially compared the best free throw shooters and the worst free throw shooters in terms of how they approach practice. And yeah, the best free throw shooters did think a little bit more before each repetition. They also thought a little bit more after each repetition. And I feel like that would be kind of a natural thing to do if the goal was to figure out why something was consistently short or why something was consistently to the right. But if instead the goal is to put up 500 shots, then, this sort of reflection does take extra time. And so thinking back to when I was a kid, I think if, practice was measured in, okay, play through this piece 3 times, I would maybe even play the piece faster, right? Just to see if I can get to the end of it sooner, because all I'm measuring is how quickly can I put in my repetitions. But if instead I had the wherewithal or understanding that, maybe my practice should be measured on, and can I find a solution to this one problem? Doesn't matter if it takes me 5 minutes or 50 minutes. If I can find a solution to this problem, then I'll have fixed something that day and I'll have made tangible progress. And so, I'd be curious to find out if I could have done that if I'd gone back. I don't know that I would have. Maybe depends on my age at the time, but I'd like to think that I would have been much more engaged as a practicer from an earlier age. Because I was pretty curious about things. Like in other parts of my life, I wanted to know why things worked and why things didn't, and why certain things led to certain results and why certain things didn't. And I'd like to think that would translate to me practicing on the violin too.
Well, we're getting lots of questions about young kids and how to get them thinking this way, because who was it? Someone near the bottom of the chat said, Ella said, I try to get them to problem solve like this and they get quite irritated. They just want to play.
Yeah.
Totally understand that. So Ella says here, any suggestions on how you can encourage young students to start thinking this way? We're not going to get a 10-year-old who's never done this to suddenly start being completely self-regulated in their learning, are we? There's got to be a bit of a path, but how do we start this with our younger students?
Yeah, and I think it's unreasonable to expect that someone of any age really is going to transform all of their practice into only this kind of very thoughtful, methodical, deliberate practice all the time. I think actually it's even okay sometimes to encourage students to just play and enjoy the playing and not worry about the mistakes they make and so forth. The concertmaster of the Milwaukee Symphony, who's retired from that position, but Frank Almond, some of you might know, I mean, he admitted that sometimes he'll just play some Bach or play some Paganini when he's practicing with no intention of trying to make it any better. He just wants to play it because he enjoys it and he likes it and it's sort of fun. And so I think if kids know that they can do that, and that part of their practice time could be devoted to that, and maybe parts of it to problem solving, can be really helpful. So to that question, one of my advisors in grad school in psychology was always reminding us, he used to say, if you misdiagnose the problem, you're probably going to misdiagnose the solution. And I think a big part of getting into the habit of deliberate practice is getting better at diagnosis. And a big part of better diagnosis is specificity. Because I think there's a tendency for us to think, oh, that sounded bad, or that was out of tune, or I missed some notes. But to not actually identify exactly what about it was bad or out of tune or didn't get played and so forth. So even just getting better at describing exactly what happened and why you're not pleased with it. I don't mean you, the teacher, but the student, the 5-year-old or the 10-year-old, even if they can describe a little bit more clearly what exactly happened, I think that even in of itself is a really helpful first step to making this more of an automatic process so that they're able to think more concretely. It kind of reminds me, I mean, even in terms of, musical things, not just missing notes, but pianist Leon Fleischer once said something to the effect with this ensemble he was working with that he was trying to get them to be a little bit more specific about what sort of character or mood they were trying to communicate to the audience in this particular section. And generally their words were pretty generic and vague, like cheerful or upbeat or happy. And he wanted much more kind of nuanced and descriptive language than that. And ultimately he just said to them that, it's, if you are having difficulty describing or articulating in words what it is that you're going for, it's probably because the concept isn't clear enough in your head. Like you can't hear it or you can't picture it exactly clear enough that you can't describe it. So I think there's a lot to be said for, like parents often tell their 5-year-olds, use your words. I think there's a lot to be said for getting better at practicing talking about the things that we're trying to do and the things that we hear and are playing, even just as a first step.
I remember seeing Professor Bob Duke in action doing a keynote masterclass teaching, and I picked up a lot from that and had him on my podcast as well. And he talks about this same thing, Noah, which is that the students have to be willing to listen and be actively conscious of what sound they're making. So let's take just playing, because I try and work with my kids on this with their trumpet. So so we'll say, okay, well, let's just play through the first 4 bars of this piece, and I want you to listen to how it goes and be able to tell me one thing that you want to improve on the next playthrough. And so we'll do that, and they may say, I don't know, it sounded good or whatever, and we'll just go with that. Let's go with that first note, which kind of went. It didn't. We wanted to go straight on the note, so let's try just doing that. That's our only goal. One thing. nice clean starting note. So just kind of simplifying down, I think, tends to work with those students. And as you've said, asking them questions which they'll hopefully then be able to start asking themselves, which Caroline's actually said in the chat there too. Rebecca says this also happens in the Yamaha method, even in 4-year-old classes, but it's teacher-led until 6 or 7 years old. We want them to hopefully take it over. And I don't know if you can see there from Claire Noah. She says, I often ask younger students how they feel about their performance even during the lessons, then follow up with what we could do to make it better. It's great to give them ownership, isn't it? And to challenge them to come up with the answers. Often we talk too much. I think more questions are really good. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And even in terms of how we frame things, I suspect that a lot of the teachers who are here already have really creative ways of engaging with their students without them feeling like they're making mistakes left and right. Because in a way, that's kind of what it feels sometimes like our job is as teachers, to like highlight all the things that are not going well so that we can help them improve them. But sometimes it's helpful to obviously highlight the things that are going well. But one of the things that seems to work with a lot of students at any age is thinking of the mistakes they're making, not as mistakes that they're making and things that sound bad, but, you know, problems that they'd love to find a solution to. And a lot of times that reframing of, oh, you know, I'd love to have a solution to this thing that keeps happening can make them a little bit more excited about trying new things and seeking out adjustments, and trying to explore those.
We've got more great suggestions coming from the chat as well. Vanessa says, I ask my students to score their performance out of 10 and then ask them what they would need to get them to a 10 out of 10, assuming it's not already. That's a simple one. Or you could do that for one bar or one challenging section. What do you give yourself out of 10? And how can we get that up? And Christine says she's got the perfect prop for this, a detective hat and magnifying glass. Can't wait to use them to investigate a solution. I love that as well. And Chris asked, before even playing, is it beneficial for the student to have a question in mind?
I would be curious to have more detail about what the question means, but because in a way, I wonder, I don't know that I understand the question, to be honest.
Okay. Feel free to elaborate, Chris. What we're going to do is talk a little bit about, because that's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is this. It sounded better at home. We've all heard it. Who said it? All right, okay, I want a yes in the comments if you've either heard it or said it yourself. And I've said it myself. I've gone to a masterclass and gone, oh no, this really did sound better at home. So Noah, help us out. Why does it always sound better at home, and how do we elevate practice so that the performance outcomes can be more reliable?
Right.
So we've got lots of yeses coming through now.
Well, I would expect all 160 people to say yes, for being honest. So I find this really fascinating. It's not unique to music. It happens in sports and in math and science and so forth, but it's called the mastery illusion. And the way that we often approach practicing tends to lend itself to thinking that we're capable of playing better than we actually are. And so there are these different types of practice. There's, distributed practice, there's variable practice, there's interleave practice, there's deliberate, there's all these different types of practice. But one of the types of practice that tends to be pretty universal, because it's just easier for us to keep track of, is called blocked practice. And this is where we'll take a tricky passage or piece and we'll practice it over and over until it sounds better, right? So the second time sounds better than the first, the third's better than the second, fourth, fifth, etc. And then we get to a point where we feel pretty good about it, feels pretty solid, and maybe we can even do it, perfectly in a row multiple times. But then, even when we start practicing the next day, if we were to start off with that particular passage, even then, generally, it doesn't go exactly the way we want on the very first repetition. We still need a few repetitions to kind of work ourselves up to it. And so essentially, the mastery illusion is where we use how we sound at the end of practice as an indicator of how much learning has taken place, instead of looking at the difference between how we started on one day of practice and how we started on the next day of practice to indicate how much learning has taken place. Because a lot of practice methods, if you think of this as being minute zero, will help us sound better, and better by the time we get to the end of it. And if we think that this is how we're going to sound tomorrow, generally we're mistaken, because tomorrow when we start practicing, we don't start off here, but we regress. And there is some learning, there is some gain that's taking place, but this is called a learning effect. That other stuff, that kind of artificially inflated, momentary habit strength of skill, that's called a performance effect. And a lot of practice strategies have opposite effects on learning and performance. block practice is really good at helping us improve relatively quickly in a short span of time and getting to a higher level of performance at the end. But learning is relatively poor. Whereas other methods, like I think you've already alluded to random practice, or I've mentioned interleave practice. Interleave practice, on the other hand, will lead to less rapid improvement. So we won't go from here to here today. We'll go from like here to here, maybe still improve. But the benefit of interleaved is next time you start practicing, or tomorrow when you practice, you'll have lost less. So the net gain is greater. But the problem is the only way we can tell that we're improving is generally to say like, oh, do I sound better 5 minutes later or 2 hours later than I did when I started? And by that measure, block practice seems like it works great. And we don't realize that what we're doing is we're just getting better at making adjustments. We're not actually getting a lot of practice or getting better at getting it right the first time.
I just want to clarify in the comments, we're talking about interleaved or random practice. Therese was just asking about that. Noah, this is kind of mind-blowing, and this, I think, is the thing we want everyone to really concentrate on and take away from today. This idea of block practice, i.e. repeating a section over and over. By the 10th time you've got through it, you can do it really, really well, and you're feeling really good about it. But you come back to it the next day and it takes another 5 times for you to get it where it was. So you feel really good in the practice, but then it's not right the first time. And this is the crucial point, right? If you want to practice for performance, you want to practice in a way that the first time you play it the next day, it's right. Am I right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's not the funnest way to practice, though, because we just aren't good at knowing if we're actually learning or not, because the learning takes place, a lot of it between practice sessions, right? And so the only way to tell how much we've learned is to wait 12 hours, 24 hours, go to sleep, wake up, and then see how much slippage there's been from how we sounded. And so we don't generally have the capacity to look at learning with the kind of longer term lens. And the easiest way to approach learning is to do what feels like it's helping us improve the most rapidly right now. So it's not like it's our fault or our teacher's fault or anybody's fault. It's just, how else are we going to know if we've really learned effectively or not in the moment? And we really can't. And so this is where, fortunately, there's been research done that lets us know which strategies seem to lead to greater learning and retention and which ones seem to lead to an inflated level of performance in the short term, but less retention and learning in the long term.
And I use this you can use this with students in any subject or any kind of knowledge retention. If you repeat the same thing over and over, lots and lots of times, yes, you'll remember that. But the skill that the challenge for the brain in retrieving something that it's learned 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, is harder, but makes the knowledge stick better. That's what I've found. So if you can kind of break up the things you do into smaller amounts and come back to it, your brain's got to go, oh, what did I do here? Oh, that's really hard. But okay, I'm getting back to it now. As you say, it's a more challenging, it takes more concentration and effort in some ways, but the results, as you say, can really have an impact. I want to bring up a comment that I read on your website or something that you created, which said, aiming for too much consistency in one's playing during practice can lead to more mistakes on stage. I'm going to say that again. Aiming for too much consistency in one's playing during practice can lead to more mistakes on stage. And this sounds completely counterintuitive. Surely the more correct, because we're taught, right? Practice doesn't make perfect, but perfect practice makes perfect, or something like that. Is that the saying you've heard as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the problem, there's lots of, I totally understand where that statement is coming from, and there is truth to it in the right interpretation. But it can also, I think, be problematic for lots of other reasons. For one, it leads to too much of what's called constant practice, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second, and why that's problematic. But also, I think it leads to a lot less risk-taking in practice. And I remember watching this Leon Fleischer masterclass, and even he was talking about how, there's no metronome police in the practice room. Like, there's nothing stopping you from trying new things and making mistakes because they don't work out, and more freely kind of trying to go to the limits of things, playing too fast or too loud or too slow, and just seeing what happens. And so, but more to your immediate question of what I meant by that is, there's a lot of interesting research around what's called variable or varied practice, as a contrast to what's known as constant practice. And I think intuitively we think that, okay, if I want to be able to play something a certain way on stage, I need to see if I can get it twice in a row exactly like this, or 3 times in a row, or 5 times in a row, or, if I try to get it 5 times in a row and the 5th time it's not right, then I have to start over again and try to get 5 in a row exactly like this. And it feels like the right thing to do. The problem, though, is, well, I guess I should start with a study that illustrates it. So they did this study with a bunch of kids and had them practice throwing beanbags into buckets at different distances. So one group practiced throwing beanbags into buckets 3 feet away. Another group practiced throwing beanbags into buckets at 2 feet and 4 feet. And I know that for those not in the United States, feet may not translate very well, but I can't do the conversion.
No, it's all right. We get it.
Yeah.
We get it.
So then, after some practice at this, they were all tested, but they were only tested at 3 feet. So in my head, when I'm looking at this, I'm like, well, obviously the group that practiced at 3 feet would have this huge advantage because they got to practice the thing that they're being tested on. Whereas the group that practiced at 2 and 4 feet, that's nice, but they never got to actually practice the thing they're being tested on. Of course, it turns out that the group that only practiced at 2 and 4 and never at 3 were more accurate at 3 feet than the group that only practiced at 3. And they've done this in different settings, in basketball and so forth, where it turns out that, if you only practice this very narrow version of a skill, that's fine and dandy. But then, especially under pressure, or, if you think about playing something in a particular way for pianists, like you don't get to play on the same piano that you learned how to do this on in a performance. The piano is different. So you're going to have to do wildly different things sometimes depending on the touch and the acoustics and so forth. And so once you start deviating from this thing that you learned how to do on your piano in your practice room, and you have to do something over here and over here, you're taking lots more risks that you never practiced taking. And so it's less likely that you're going to be able to replicate the goal of those movements that you had worked on when it really counts. And so essentially the goal is to do something that one of the viola faculty at Juilliard says he does. His name is Toby Apple. He's kind of a character, interesting story and life history he's had. But so it kind of makes sense when you know who he is, the saying that he said. But basically he said he doesn't practice what he's going to do on stage so much as he practices all the things that he might do on stage. And that's kind of a nice way of summarizing what variable practice looks like. So it means, more vibrato or a little bit faster or, different characters slightly here and there. It doesn't mean anything goes willy-nilly, but it means that instead of this very narrow range of how you think a passage should sound, to basically widen the box a little bit and try different things. And actually, Martin Krauss, Claudio Rao's teacher, apparently had his students play things in wildly different ways. Things that were not called for in the score and would not be appropriate and true to the composer's intent. But, just to cultivate what he called reserves of technique. So that way you could make it sound on stage like you could play it a lot faster or slower or more articulated or articulated in this other way if you wanted to. You may not, but it sounds like you certainly could. And it sounds easier and more effortless. And it actually results in more robust and reliable, durable skill.
Claire said, so are we talking about variable rhythms and tempos? Not so much, Claire. What we're talking about is breaking up the segments that need to be practiced. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Noah. This is my understanding, and I'm trying to absorb this. And by speaking it back to you, I think I'm learning it more myself. We're taking different sections of challenges in the piece, and instead of playing one until it's absolutely perfect and then playing it another 5 times until it's really, really perfect, we're just doing it a few times, and it may not actually get to perfection. And then we're going to move on to the next section, and we're going to try a different part, and we're going to do that just 2 or 3 times. It's not going to quite be right. It's going to be really frustrating. And then we're going to go to a third one, and then we might come back to the first one, and we're going to do it a few more times. That's got to be really frustrating to do, right? Because you're never quite getting that mastery that we want.
Right, right. And I should be clear to clarify, there's a difference between variable practice and interleaved or random practice as well. And the two are complementary and you can do them both at the same time and so forth. But variable practice would be not so much switching between different passages or different sections or different pieces, but playing the same passage in a variety of different ways. So there's a famous motor learning researcher who said the goal essentially was repetition without repetition. So you play the same thing multiple times and aim for the same high level that you aspire to, but without doing it in exactly the same way. So it's not like, you're using the same number of wiggles of vibrato, or you're not, shifting into a particular position with, your violin at a 47.5-degree angle relative to the ground with your bow, in a very specific, like there's a lot more flexibility that we can create for ourselves by achieving the same result, but in slightly different ways. Whereas with interlead practice, like you were saying, it's essentially about, and this may not work for someone who's just starting to learn their instrument, or on the first day bringing in, for the first lesson, a new piece that they started working on. Like they may have enough things floating around in their head that they're struggling with to just kind of keep things together, to start adding all this other extra stuff to the equation. But for someone who's starting to get, the notes in their fingers and starting to feel more comfortable and starting to approach wanting to play this through or perform it in the studio class and so forth, this is where the interlead practice of, jumping around between different sections, but coming back multiple times in the same practice session ends up being really important. Because the key thing, what we're trying to do essentially is accelerate the forgetting process. So even in a lesson, for instance, if you're working with a student on a new technique and maybe you're doing some scales or arpeggios and they're struggling with one particular section of a particular scale or arpeggio, you might start off the lesson with it to kind of see where things are, and then, move on to working on some other pieces that they're playing. And then 10 minutes later, say, all right, let's try that scale again, and just give them one shot at seeing if they can get the scale the way that you guys worked on it. And maybe it doesn't go quite so well. Maybe it gets better, maybe it gets worse. And then you go back to working on some other things and the timer goes off again 10 minutes later. It's like, all right, let's try this again. And so basically you're trying to accelerate the forgetting of how to play this passage. So instead of playing it, 5-10 times in a row at the beginning of the lesson till it sounds better, to see how it evolves over the course of the lesson as they practice retrieving these skills that they need to play that passage the way that they want.
Well, I hope you enjoyed hanging out with Noa and me today. Isn't he just the most calm and cool and collected kind of guy just to listen to? It's almost soothing just listening to him. But what I hope you do is take what he said and try them out. And I do want to encourage you, if you've enjoyed this, to check out our course called Practice Hacks. We actually invited Noa to create a short course for us. It's just 4 modules, but I tell you what, they are packed and powerful. It's available for one-off purchase over at our courses platform, topmusic.co/courses. Or if you're already a Top Music Pro member, you'll know that that's already in your library. And I also just wanted to mention and remind you about the Top Music Teacher's Guide to Fearless Performing. This is available now as a special feature of our focus this month on performing and being stage ready. If you head over to topmusic.co/guide, you can use that as another way to dip your toe in the water, or you can use it with Noa's course as double the fun, double the learning. Until then, I'm Tim Topham, and you've been listening to the Topcast. Can't wait to speak to you again next week. How do you keep up to date with all the latest trends and research into music education? How do you connect with other teachers around the world and make sure your teaching stays fresh and relevant for students of all ages and stages, both now and into the future? I created our Top Music Pro membership to be the one-stop shop for music teaching resources, training, support, and community, and I'd love for you to come and join us inside. With over 40 comprehensive training courses, hundreds of teaching demonstrations and lesson plans, free monthly sheet music, discounts, and all the business and pedagogy support you could ever need, Top Music Pro is the community you've been looking for. If you're ready to level up your learning from the podcast and join thousands of other teachers in our global network, head over to topmusicpro.com today. If you enjoy this show and want to hear more of our work, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening today. For links and resources mentioned in this episode, visit us at topmusic.co/podcast or check out the show notes. I'm Tim Topham. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy your week ahead, and I'll catch you next time.